Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to welcome you back to another one of our series, our Inversant Insight series. As you know, those of you who are in our audience who tune into us at previous shows, this is an opportunity for us to have conversations with some amazing people from around the country who are involved in conversations or activities focused on access and opportunity in higher education. What our institutions doing, what our community-based organizations doing, what's philanthropy doing, what's government doing. We're looking at these issues from a lot of broad perspectives because we believe that right now in the country, there's a great push to get more students into higher education through and on to graduation, and that our having these conversations provides us with an opportunity to offer some insights and perspectives that can help make this process move along more smoothly, or offer ways to support the dialogues and discussions about access and opportunity in higher education. I'm really happy today to say that this episode of Inversant Insights is being sponsored by one of our board members. Her name is Roz Hill. She's a philanthropist, she's an activist, and she's an education leader in Boston, engaged on a lot of different issues in the greater Boston area. And we are so fortunate to have her on the board of Inversant, helping us in a variety of different ways as a thought partner and in other relationship building activities that advance our work. So we want to say, Roz, thank you very much for your help and support. So today, the theme of our discussion, the broad overarching umbrella in which we're operating, is closing the equity and achievement gap in higher education, the equity and the achievement gap in higher education. And we couldn't have two better people to help us with this conversation than Dr. Lucie Lapovsky. She's the principal with Lapovsky Consulting, and she's the principal of Lapovsky Consulting. And we also have Kevin Fudge, who's the director of advocacy at the American Student Assistance Corporation. Let me just say a few words about Lucie, and then a few words about Kevin, and then we'll dive into our conversation. Lucie is a well-known expert in the higher education finance governance, and she is an economist who consults, writes, and speaks widely on higher education finance, pricing, governance, and enrollment management. She's actively engaged in research on price resets, tuition discounting, and cost containment. Now, these may be words that you may not all be familiar with, but before the show is over, you're going to be an expert on some of these matters. She served as president of Mercy College, a multi-campus institution of 10,000 undergraduate and graduate students with campuses in New York City, Westchester, and online from 1999 to 2004. Let me emphasize that online aspect of her work, because this is a very big component that we're across the nation looking at with regards to access and equity in higher ed. What does online higher education offer to us in that domain? Prior to coming to Mercy College, she served as vice president for finance at Goucher College and worked at the University of Maryland in College Park, the Maryland Higher Education Commission, and the Maryland State Department of Budget and Fiscal Planning. Now, that's not all I could say about it, but that's as much as I need to say. That would suffice to say, I've known her for quite a while, and she's a powerhouse of information and knowledge. Let me turn now to Kevin Fudge, who's the director of advocacy at the American Student Assistance. Kevin has worked for the past 15 years with ASA to improve college access, college completion rates, and successful higher education debt management. In his current role, he supports these goals by working with policymakers, state agencies, and nonprofit organizations to help drive public awareness about the college financing process. I want to emphasize that these issues around financing in higher education for non-traditional students is at the heart of the access and equity issue. And if we can't figure out a way to deal with the issues around cost and affordability, I'm not sure that we're going to be able to make too much of a heavy inroad in addressing the concerns that we're all focusing on. His work involves public awareness about the college financing process, solutions to complex student loan situations to stakeholders in higher education, and workforce development. In addition to advocating for student loan borrowers, Kevin promotes the notion that post-secondary education includes options other than traditional four-year colleges. Before coming to ASA's Director of Advocacy, Kevin was Manager of Consumer Advocacy and Government Relations and Education Finance Advisor. So let me say that we couldn't have had, as I said at the outset, two more engaged people in this process with regards to higher education, access and affordability and equity. And both of you bring unique perspectives to this conversation. And I think what I'd like to do, Kevin, is start with you, if I could, because at the heart of our efforts, if we can't get students poised and ready to pursue higher education, then regardless of what the institutions want to do or may want to do, we're going to be bumping up against significant walls. And in that respect, I want to say that we had a pre-COVID environment, we have the COVID environment, and we may have a post-COVID environment. So right now, I'd like to ask you, as you're looking at what students are facing right now, can you give us some insights about what kinds of pressures students are experiencing and what you're seeing with regards to choices and options that students are facing?
Certainly. Thanks for the question, and thanks everybody for being here today. It's interesting because, in a pre-COVID environment, we're sort of in the middle of, or towards the tail end of the College for All movement, which is to say that, that's the aspiration is for everybody to be ready and able and willing to go to a college, theoretically a four-year school. And what we were starting to see pre-COVID is this idea of degrees as more signaling devices rather than an actual true credential. And so as employers are like, how do we diversify our talent pipelines? How can we help young people develop skills and talents and abilities to translate into the workplace? How can we expose them to what's possible and then figure out all the different avenues to which to get there? Obviously, higher ed being one of them. I think what we're seeing now in the COVID environment is an interesting examination of that point. And it's to say that, well, if I'm being remote and I'm going to school, I'm still being charged full price. And so if I'm paying, at a private institution anywhere from, $60,000, $70,000, is this credential that I'm getting, is this still worth it? And are there other ways for me to access this information or develop these skills so that I can get into the workforce, which, by the way, is looking very different, obviously, with so much being virtual versus, what's going on in the front lines. So, I think the main issue is obviously connectivity. Those of you who are following what's happening in the K-12 side, particularly in secondary education, will note, the numbers of students that aren't even connecting in the first place, and how what we're trying to do from a broadband as a public utility, being able to provide access to people so that they can actually learn and become engaged. But then the question is, well, when they are engaged, what are they actually doing, and how does that translate to the next steps? Because from my observations, one of the big challenges that higher ed has to face as a business, as an entity, is accepting students that have not been academically prepared, but accepting them anyway, and then not providing them either with the financial resources or the academic support in which to succeed. So then you end up having students who go to school, leave, but then have debt. And so often when we talk about student debt, we're measured the number of people that are graduated with debt, and we're not focused enough on the people who started school, didn't finish, but have debt, and how that cripples them, both economically and then also academically from continuing to pursue should they re-enroll. So I think, the big takeaway here is focus on connectivity, making sure students are able and have the access. And then what types of experiences are they having connecting when they do? And then what is the role of higher ed in the workforce in tandem, helping students develop those skills and identify ways that they can be engaged.
That's a lot going on right there in that space that you just mentioned. And I'm going to switch to Lucie, because on the higher education side, you have there's been a tremendous amount of work that's been going on in the higher education space with regards to the changing demographic of students that are coming into the higher education environment. At the same time, in colleges and universities, obviously, just for for enrollment and sustainability efforts see the value of diversifying their student population and opening the doors towards higher education. But in that context of where we are right now, as institutions are looking at who's in the pipeline and are they going to be able to get to their institution, could you say a few words from your experience about what's happening around FAFSA completion or student application rates or the other variables that are indicators of the fact that the problem that we might have been looking at pre-COVID may be even more problematic in the environment we're in right now?
Well, thanks, Charlie, and thank you for that lovely, long introduction. But it's a pleasure to be with all of you. And Kevin, you certainly laid out a broad agenda. I think colleges are all struggling to get students. There's a demographic downturn, especially in the East, in the Midwest. And so they are out there trying to get more students. Colleges have been doing quite well on the access end. We're getting students in from all socioeconomic classes. And we've become fairly even in that, with the one big difference: women are going at much higher rates to college than men. We fail in terms of success, which Kevin touched on in terms of debt. The worst case scenario is where a student drops out and has taken out a loan or has an unpaid bill, because then they can't get a transcript. A college will hold their transcript as their way of getting paid. And so although we tend to look at debt of college graduates, where I actually think it's not nearly the serious issue for most students, as is often portrayed in the press, because college does give you an increase in your human capital. And the data does show that graduating from college will give you an increase in income anywhere from $600,000 to $1.3 million over your lifetime. And therefore, as long as you've been strategic about your debt, you should be able to pay it off. Most students end up graduating with $28,000 to $30,000 in debt, which is the price of a car. It's not outrageous. There clearly are outliers. Those are the ones we read about in the newspapers who have $100,000 or more of debt. But there's no doubt there are options for students where they can go to community college at a very low price and transfer to an in-state four-year public where they don't have to get into a lot of debt. So it's often a choice. And then we have a set of private institutions, our most elite, which subsidize low-income students very, very well. And then there's a whole middle group of higher ed where students can often go into big debt if they choose to go. I think COVID has led to some real big issues. One, we've seen the completion of FAFSA forms decline significantly last year, and they're way down to the first month, October, where they've been tracked, which means we may be losing low-income students going on to college. We also see that community college enrollment, which tends to be the place more low-income students go, their enrollment, the latest report from the Greenhouse shows is down 10%, and freshman enrollment is down 13% in fall 2020, and at community colleges, it's down 19%. This, to me, is a very serious issue, because this could be a whole generation or a whole cohort of students that we're losing. And I have no idea whether they're stopping out and going to start back in the spring, or they're going to wait till next fall, or whether they will never pursue, or not for many years, their dream of a college education. Because the data shows if you stop out or if you don't start, your probability of getting that degree is much lower than if you continue on from high school into college. So I think there's some really serious issues. There are a lot of organizations. I'm on the board of something called the Education Foundation in Sarasota, Florida, where we have a whole program with trying to get students to fill out their FAFSAs, providing all kinds of support. And in this age of COVID, where in Florida, we're less Zoom friendly, we're more in person. We don't believe in the virus, but where our students are just not getting the support because there's not nearly as much one-to-one coaching and all that to help them do it. That we're making incredible outreach to these students and their families to try to get them to fill it out, because we don't want to lose these students. And then the other thing I should say about college is, I said we've done pretty well up until this year on access, on getting students in, but we haven't done well on getting students out. The divide when you look at graduation rates socioeconomically and by race, ethnicity, grows quite significantly, whereas it's much more even on entrance.
Thank you very much. I think that gives us again, we're looking sort of at the landscape under which we're operating. I'm going to switch back to Kevin to say, I'm disturbed about the data that's lining up with regards to community college choices that, as you know, for most low income and students of color, community colleges are the gateway institutions for many into higher education, and transfer agreements and co-programs and articulation agreements between 2 and 4 year institutions, primarily in the public sector, but growing in the private sector, are helpful. But does this data that Lucie was just talking about with regards to fewer students completing FAFSA would lead you to believe that fewer students are thinking about or considering going on to higher ed, and declining enrollments in freshman classes are problematic? Are you, in the context of your advocacy work, are you seeing similar patterns here in the New England area?
Yes and no. I mean, I think, like I said, it's not a zero-sum game. So if they aren't enrolling, then what's the alternative? And what I've been focusing on is on the workforce development side and seeing sort of those hybrid approaches. Well, not so much in New England, but nationwide. If you look at some community college, I think Ivy Tech in Indiana is very well known for their efforts to be engaged with advanced manufacturing. Mm-hmm. And on the surface, it is concerning. I would just look at though what else is being done and how is the void being filled. I would also say that I think part of the challenge is particularly up here in the Northeast is just general behavioral economics. If it costs less, therefore it must not be as good. And since we have so many name brand colleges up here that tend to skew people's idea of what college is, particularly not just among consumers, students and families, but among teachers and counselors. I recall an incident a few years ago where a young woman was accepted into a state school and was also accepted to a private school in the Boston area. Now, what's interesting, there's about 60 private colleges, give or take, in the greater Boston area, and there's 60 colleges in the entire state of Indiana, just to give you some perspective on that. But the school counselor said, go to this private college. It's an investment in your future, and forget the fact that you got a full ride from the state school. So it was interesting. The young woman, her mom, if I remember her tax return correctly, it was $14,872 as adjusted gross income for a family of 3. And this private school gave her a financial aid package with a gap of about $40,000. So when I called the school, and I was like, I'm a bit puzzled by this, because here's a student that's 0 EFC, expected family contribution, completely eligible for the full Pell Grant Award, and yet she has a gap of about $40,000. And the school was like, oh, well, we can, let's see, have her parent fill out the PLUS loan application, parent loan for undergraduate students. And if she gets rejected, she'll get an additional $4,000 in unsubsidized funds. And I was like, wait, you don't understand. You're asking her to take out a loan more than her yearly income. And how does that make sense? And then, even if she does get the additional $4,000 in unsubsidized funds, she's still short like roughly $35,000. What's your plan for that? Oh, we can give her another institutional loan. And I was like, all right, well, let's hold on that conversation for a bit. So I called the dean of the school, the public school in Massachusetts, the young woman was admitted to, because this conversation was actually happening in August. And I said, can this student still enroll? She declined the offer originally, but on further review, this seems to be the better course of action. Graciously, they accepted her, gave her her full ride still. And then I went back to the school where she wasn't going to go in Boston, and I said, can you return her $600 non-refundable deposit? Because to a family that makes less than $15,000 a year, $600 is a lot of money. And you can guess where this is going, right? The school was like, nope, we're not doing this. I was like, I don't think you understand. They're like, no, we're not going to give her her money back. So it took the threat of going to the Boston Globe, which is our paper of record here, and telling the college president, do you really want this paper, this story front and center above the fold to get her money back? But I say that because it illustrates sort of how there are so many different components to this process, right? We mentioned how access is the point, but college access just isn't getting in. College access is getting in, getting through, and then satisfying any debt that was obtained to get the degree. And until kind of we adopt that mentality, we're going to see some of the challenges. But I think from an institutional perspective, it just goes to show you how, I don't know if the word is myopic, tunnel vision, like just can't see, for the forest for the trees, but how somebody who's in an administrative role and in a senior leadership role at that school in Boston could think that somehow that's okay. And just say, well, it's up to the student whether they want to take that risk. And I think colleges have some responsibility for mitigating some of that risk and not putting the onus all on students. So, but the larger point is getting it back to community colleges. The school counselor didn't look at the lower cost option as a viable option, and told the student to go to the more riskier option because theoretically it would pay off in the long run, when in fact, we've seen evidence that that's not necessarily the case. So I think it's a combination of, for systems and schools to identify the two-year college as a viable option, but also recognize that when students are not taking advantage of that opportunity, what is their end game? What is their goal? And how do they want to get those skills so that they can be part of the workforce and maybe go to school at a later date? Obviously, the evidence shows that if you stop out, you're not likely to go. But can we bring in the private sector to be more partners in that? And you're starting to see that in major areas. And like I said, Indiana with its advanced manufacturing, and then New York City with its partnerships with their community colleges. But how do we bring that effort more widespread, I think is the goal.
Well, I think that institution needs to hire Lucie immediately to have a conversation about exactly the issue that you're raising. And it really deals with, Lucie, the issue about, what's the stake of the public and private institutions around the equity and achievement gap. It seems as though to me that, this is an interesting inflection point in our conversation today, in the sense that these institutions have to continue to stay alive. They just can't simply give everyone a free 4-year scholarship. But at the same time, we have these larger issues around, if we don't start making greater shifts for greater equity and opportunity in higher ed, the societal implications of that are so profound and so problematic that they present real challenges for us. So in your conversations with, well, before I ask that question, how do you respond to what Kevin just said?
Well, I'm sitting here mulling it over because he said an awful lot, and there's a lot of really important information in there. So number one, I think more and more people are over the price-quality relationship. Because on the one hand, we have a whole set of public institutions which operate at much lower price than private institutions. And a lot of the work I do on tuition reset shows that we're past what we call Chivas Regal or the Tiffany effect or whatever. There's also data where you go back to what this high school counselor advised that shows, especially for the, most students will do well irrespective of where they go to college. At the most elite or prestigious school, there's a network you get. But at most of the rest of the schools, it doesn't make much difference. And at the most elite, wealthiest schools, they have a lot of money, and the low-income student actually is likely to pay less going to Harvard or Amherst or Williams than they'll pay at the local community college because they really have the money to support them. Most schools, probably like the school in Boston that you talked about, are unable to afford to support students the way they ought to. And the dilemma is, do you dissuade them from going? And I would argue you should dissuade them from going, and the honest broker at the college level and the good high school counselor will bring in the issue of both what's the best school you can go to and what is the cost, and the cost-benefit analysis. And, gapping a student like that is ridiculous. It makes no sense. And the high school counselor should certainly have seen it. But there are a lot of high school counselors that are terribly overworked, don't have the time to be with their students, and are not necessarily overly savvy about the financial aspects of the whole thing. So there's a lot of dysfunction on that end, whereas why an organization like the Education Foundation that I'm working with, and others that are, and I'm sure your organization, that are providing support for students outside of the school in order to help them. In terms of success, I would argue going to college is a good thing. There are lots of partnerships. I think one of the things where people are concerned about colleges is outcomes and how your degree relates to a job. Now, we do know those students who get the liberal arts degree, the philosophy degree, or the English degree, after a few years tend to do as well or better than the engineer, and their income curve actually is steeper, whereas the engineers is flatter. They'll get a much better job out of college. But parents and students today are loath to sort of buy the pig in the poke and hope everything will work out, and want a much closer relationship between what I'm doing in college and what kind of job, which leads to the partnerships. It leads to internships. It leads to much more experiential learning. It leads to the few colleges, and I'm always surprised there aren't more, like Northeastern and Drexel, which have co-op programs where you go to school one term and you go to work one term, and that helps you pay for school. It's tremendous resume building. It gives you great experience and lets you see what you really want to do when you get out of college. You could make a mistake in one or two co-op terms. It's harder making a mistake, with where you decide to put your career. So there's lots of alternatives. There's an awful lot going on in terms of articulation between community colleges in 4 years. And a lot of the high-priced four-year schools are doing it with good scholarships for community college students, in part because of the demographics. Enrollment is down. Numbers of high school graduates in much of the country is declining. In order for self-preservation, schools need to keep their enrollment up. But, articulation, you start at the community college, you move to the four-year school, is a very good solution for how a student can succeed in lots of schools. And some states have taken this on, because the real problem, or one of the big problems with transferring from a community college to a four-year school, is that you often lose a lot of credits. So you end up having to take 5 or 6 years of college rather than 4, because the four-year school won't accept many of the credits that you've taken in a community college. And so some states have passed in legislation that if you get an AA degree from a community college, all those credits need to transfer to a four-year school. There still can be issues with what major, but that certainly helps you in moving along. But I would argue strongly for students starting college out of high school and going full-time and going as quickly as they can. Charlie, when you and I talked yesterday, we talked about ways to get through college more economically. And
Yes.
college, many schools you can get through in 3 years. To get 4 years of college, learning in your degree in 3, only paying for 3 years. Also today, there's early college, high school, where at many schools you can graduate high school with 2 years of college credit. There are students that take AP exams or the International Baccalaureate and start college with credit. Students should think about taking advantage of all of those opportunities to get through college, to have to purchase fewer college credits and to reduce the cost. If you can reduce 1 year of tuition and you can get in the labor force earlier, that's wonderful, because actually the biggest cost of college is the opportunity cost of your wages foregone with that college degree. You can make more when you have your degree than if you're going part-time and taking sort of minimum wage jobs while you're working your way through college. So there are lots of ways of looking at how to do it. But yes, we need to provide more opportunities. And yes, we need more financial aid. And the federal government should double the price of their Pell Grant, which is one of the things being talked about. I mean, there's ways for more financial aid, but I think students also ought to be just as Kevin talks about, smart about the school they go to. And students who work at their colleges will get a good education. There are honors programs at all schools. The student who works will come out in a good shape and be in good shape moving into the labor force. And they shouldn't get themselves over in debt. And there shouldn't be a need to.
Well, I certainly agree with the points that you just made, and I wanted to just quickly step back to say, while the guidance council that you talked about in that incident, Kevin, it points two things to me. One is we ought to be equally as concerned with how well guidance counselors are trained and supported, so that they can make the kinds of recommendations that will work in the best interest of the students that they're serving. And I think that instance that you raised, that you discussed, clearly was a case where the best interest of the student, and ultimately was not going to be met by the choice that was given. The other thing I wanted to make with regards to that is well-informed guidance counselors are involved in this undermatching issue. So a low-income student who they may be advising, maybe selecting a lower cost school, while if they had good information and good advice, could perhaps go to a school better resourced and get better financial aid as a result of just getting good guidance and good support on how that can happen. And I think that's what Lucie is saying, that there's many institutions that are motivated and inspired in wanting to do that. So I definitely feel that that's a direction in which we have to start focusing more of our attention. Let me ask the question about the fact that public institutions right now are feeling pressure and stress about what they can provide to students because of cutbacks in state budgeting. Even here in Massachusetts, which is a strong advocate of articulation agreements between 2-year institutions and 4-year institutions. The New England Board of Higher Education is working aggressively on building articulation agreements between 2-year publics and 2-year private institutions as well as public institutions. But if the funding streams are not there, that presents real issues to us. And coupled with that, higher income students are seeing, well, we don't have the resources to go to the private that I wanted to go to. So now public education becomes more of an option to them. So all of this creates a mix in which it's harder for us to make choices and to see opportunities that might be available for all the students we want to serve. As you're talking with students again, and as ASA, who is a national leader on these conversations, are you seeing more pressure for students to get into these public institutions with the kind of support that they need in order to succeed and pursue their education there?
Yeah, I would just say that it's interesting. There's a lot of talk about how COVID has laid bare the digital divide and, the America's racial reckoning and the disproportionate impact on COVID on people of color. I've been making the argument for years that higher education lays bare the inequities of our K-12 system. As long as our education system is funded K-12 based on property values, you're going to have inequitable outcomes. But higher education has been seen as this great equalizer, well, if you just go to college, everything will work out and be okay. And as we've seen, even students who have attended, New York Times had a great series of articles about what it's like to be poor at an Ivy League school. So you can have a full ride and still have, a compromised experience. I think from the public school perspective, I always look at what Georgia State has done, both with regards to its access and retention, and then with the issue about emergency grants and understanding, it's not always about money. Obviously, money plays a huge role, but it's the little things. It's the helping a student who may have had to drop a class for a particular reason because something they missed $100 and it didn't go through. And so emergency grants just isn't for food insecurity, but for other things and to help just to navigate. Right? I often say financial aid is a language unto itself. And, we expect, people who may have never paid for school before because they pay taxes and they go to public school, but yet now they're entering this whole realm where they're filling out a financial aid application, taking out loans, and we expect them to be super literate. It's maybe learning Mandarin or Swahili through Rosetta Stone in a week, and then you're expected to be fluent and articulate points in the United Nations. It's just, we take for granted, when I say we, people in higher ed, the language of higher ed, EFC, I said that, and I'm always mindful of explaining what that is. Pell, Stafford, and they're highly educated people who you get confused by filling out a financial aid form. So I think dialing it back and understanding impact, where we can have impact on students earlier in the process and bringing it more contextual rather than saying go to college, get a better job, you'll have a better life. The more we can do to provide context and at those earlier stages, I think is really helpful. And from a resource perspective on state funding, colleges have been, and especially here in Massachusetts, have been pretty clear about their strategy and attracting out-of-state students from, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, to pay out-of-state rates to make up for those budget gaps. And I think a lot of national think tanks, Center for American Progress, New American Foundation in DC have been arguing for years the importance of increasing state funding so that we can have a viable option. If people want to go on to private college and take that risk, that's great, but there should always be a robust public option that is, quote unquote affordable. I mean, the University of Massachusetts, I believe, all in is approaching, $40,000 for cost of attendance. And if you break that out in 4 years, if you pay a full way, I mean, that's $160,000 for a bachelor's degree from a state institution. I mean, that's, and it's one thing to say, when you get a bachelor's degree, you have greater lifetime earnings. But what we've seen is wage stagnation. And I mean, I don't have a graph behind me. I have a lot of pictures. This is my wife's office, and she so nicely decorated. But if I had a graph behind me, if I was like Steve Kornacki at the big board, I would show how wages have remained stagnant while debt has increased, and that gap, and also the value of the degree, right? So it's much like purchasing a new car. Like, a new car is great, but then as soon as you drive it off the lot, it depreciates in value. So we've had almost the depreciation of the value of the degree when increase in debt. And I would also make one quick point too, that it is true, the point is made earlier about, 2% of the population has above $100,000 or above in debt, and the majority of people, roughly 40%, have less than $10,000 in debt. One thing to keep in mind, though, is I made this point a few years ago in a talk, and to think about debt almost like you would the weather. And I know just go with me on this a second. We talk about the heat index or the wind chill, like what it actually feels like. So it can actually be 0 degrees outside, but with like a 15 or 20 mile an hour wind, it can feel like minus 20, right? And so $10,000 on its surface, or even between let's say $5,000 and $10,000. That frame. It doesn't seem like a lot, but for somebody who maybe have limited resources or has, many economic pressures, that is actually a lot of money. And if you look at the stats, the majority of people who are in delinquency and default with their loans have between $5,000 and $10,000. It seems counterintuitive. You think the people with a higher debt would be the ones that are struggling versus the people with a lower debt, when in fact the inverse is true. So it's not to dissuade people from going, but it makes the point that funding, we can have more funding and state institutions, that'll be great, but providing that context at an earlier age, bringing that financial literacy component. The school counselor piece is huge. I know that Colorado was one of the states that have been very active in lowering their ratio. The American School Counselor Association recommends a ratio of 1 counselor for every 250 students. And I think the national average is around 439 students to every 1 counselor. But Colorado made a very concerted effort to lower their ratios to really improve outcomes. And the way they framed it was, rather than spending money on incarceration, rehabilitation services for alcohol and drugs and other social services, we can better invest on the front end to increase our number of counselors, lower our ratio to about 1 counselor for every 217 students, and then we will have better outcomes on the back end. So I think it's just being mindful of that, all everything that's going on, and really, wherever you are in this continuum in helping students, understanding your role, but also understanding it in context, I think is helpful.
Well, I think your point is very well taken with regards to everyone has a stake in trying to figure out better strategies around equity and opportunity in higher ed. And certainly, if the states are doing a better job of making sure that students get good information, that they're being supported in the information that they receive, that they're being directed towards institutions that best match up with what their needs are, I think that may be one of the avenues that is a promising road ahead for us to pursue. Coupled with that, institutions themselves are continuing to look at new and different ways of making it more affordable and accessible to them. And when we were talking the other day, Lucie, you had said something about the idea of tuition resets or responsible packaging of aid. Can you say a little bit more about how academic leaders are thinking about that, and in the context of the constraints that they're facing budgetarily? How are they putting together packages that might make that more a viable option to provide access and give more students opportunities?
Well, I think there are two different things, actually, Charlie.
Yep.
Tuition sets are where schools are lowering their published price. And at private four-year institutions in this country now, the average discount rate or the average amount of institutional financial aid that students get is 53%. So a school that has a sticker price or tuition of $40,000, the school is actually getting slightly under $20,000 on average. And at most of these schools, almost no one, and at many, no one pays the full price. And so one of the reasons schools are resetting their price is because by having that $40,000 price or even higher, some of them, it's off-putting to students who might be willing to consider it, because higher ed pricing is very complex and very not very transparent. And so you can't predict what it's going to cost. If I apply to 5 colleges that all have the same price of $40,000, I may end up, my net price to me could range from $0 to $38,000, $40,000. And before I apply, it's difficult to know because a lot of our aid is not based on need. It's based on, quote, merit. And we define merit in a whole variety of ways. It could be my GPA, my SAT, my leadership qualities, where I come from, if I come from a state that's not well represented, et cetera. So that's one thing that makes college decision-making difficult. And as a parent, and I have 3 children, you never want your child to get into a school and then you say, I can't pay for it. They give them enough aid. So you aid them from you looking at schools that may be good for them and where they may actually get a very good deal. So that's why many schools are lowering their price. It doesn't necessarily increase access in terms of the net price students are going to pay. It does somewhat, but because they can lower the price significantly and just reduce the amount of financial aid, it just opens up the numbers of students who will look at that school. Mm-hmm. In terms of responsible packaging, there are more schools that are trying to concentrate their packaging on students who have financial need versus merit-based aid. Because we also know there is a high correlation between socioeconomic status and ability levels as we test in our normal testing way. And so there are many schools where the wealthier students are paying a lower net price than the lower income students. And to many of us, that's not a very comfortable outcome. Schools are doing this because in order to be attractive, part of your attraction is how good is your student body. And you want to be with a smart group of peers. And in order to entice the better qualified students to come, they need to provide them with financial aid, with a financial incentive, rather than just doing need-based aid. Our most difficult to get into schools only provide need-based aid because they are able to attract as many students as they want who are able to pay the full price. We're both able and willing, whereas a whole set of schools, and this occurs at public colleges as well as private, are unable to attract, students are unwilling to pay the full price, even if they are able to pay the full price. And that's something that's evolved over the last 30 or so years in higher ed. I don't think it's a good trend, but it's for the moment here to stay. In part, there's schools that would like to stop doing this, but there's been Supreme Court rulings we're not allowed to talk to each other because it's considered price collusion. And so, most schools aren't strong enough in and of themselves to change the way they're going to do discounting and providing financial aid. Whereas there have been calls by sets of schools to be able to have conversations and to all dial back the price and dial back the way they're doing aid so that the aid is concentrated on the students who are most unable to pay and therefore provide more access. So it's a very, very complex situation as to how you do it. And there's whole industries of consultants who have helped schools figure out how best to discount to maximize their net revenue and the types of students that they want. And schools need that in order to remain financially viable. They need the tuition revenue in order to be able to support their budgets. And what we see with public four-year institutions is they're doing a lot to attract out-of-state students and using very much a private college pricing model in the way they're doing their financial aid.
I just wanted to piggyback on that point. I think and I want to be very diplomatic about this.
This is to show you
I think
diplomatic on Kevin.
I think that's part of the challenge of higher education as a business, because we can all point to areas in which higher ed is competitive. Obviously, Division I athletics, the arms race with who has the best locker room. I mean, University of Alabama has a tunnel from the dorms to the stadium, so the players don't have to interact with the masses. I mean, University of Oregon's football facility, it's out of control. But this competition among, it's. I wish that there would be more collaboration rather than competition, like competing to get the best students and competing to do this. And, I don't have an opinion on the ruling about how colleges can talk to each other, because whether that constitutes price fixing or collusion. I may have some private thoughts about it, but none that I want to publicly share. But I just think that it stems from this idea that, colleges being in competition and how that then impacts consumers, and even students as consumers. Like, where are we that students are consumers? But that's the reality where we're at. It's interesting. I mean, just how colleges make their wait lists. Like, to me, like, it's either, why don't you just, I get it, from a business imperative you might have one, but now wait lists has been less of a functionality and more of a competitive tool, right? Like, you accept a student, you deny them, or you waitlist them, and then you waitlist, but then the students that get off the wait list are the ones that don't need money. And some, people are, asking me, and like, I don't have a shingle out. I'm not a formal consultant, but I do, engage with people on the side, and they ask questions like, well, so is it better for me to apply and try to get waitlisted? And if I'm waitlisted, I tell them I don't need money and then I can get in. And these are all not even central to what we're talking about, which is, how do you provide an opportunity for people to, continue their education, earn a degree, a credential to which they can then move on with their lives and, hopefully have an economically and self-sustaining career. So I don't know how you solve that challenge of competitiveness among schools, of higher education being a business. Maybe it's creating a better separation between public schools and private schools, and investing in that public option. And we've heard a lot about tuition free and what constitutes free college, and that's a whole other can of worms we don't have to necessarily unpack today. But there's a lot of data that shows how free college, much in the way that Lucie was talking about, high income students are paying less than low income students in some contexts. How free tuition actually benefits students with means versus students with limited resources. So I guess the takeaway is to really look at equity and closing those gaps, is to look at the operation of higher ed and how they can come to some place where it's less competitive and more collaborative. But I don't know, I'm not sure how that happens anytime soon.
So can I answer a few of the issues Kevin brought up? So first of all, Kevin, I think, it's interesting. Most schools don't have wait lists. More than 75% of students get into their first choice school. More significant numbers of students only apply to one school and get in. So we have this myth that's perpetuated by the most competitive schools, and everyone thinks that's the way it is. And by the schools that cost $50,000 or $60,000, that's not the universe. And so that's what the newspapers write about. So we really got to move away from all of that. In terms of, competitiveness in business, it is. You do have to run like a business. Unfortunately, there is what students expect from schools, and that does make schools invest money in things that may not be as central to the academic program. And you started by talking about the Zoom and the online. In many ways, we're frills free in our online environment. And those schools that are just doing Zoom, it's the faculty and the student and some student support services. It's really what's going on. We don't have the athletics. We don't have the residence halls. We're not feeding people. We don't have the campuses. So, the schools that are entirely online actually have done very well in this environment. They've had enrollment increases. They know how to do it. And there's a different business model for them. And they can operate much more efficiently and effectively. It begs the whole question, what's college? I would argue the 4-year liberal arts residential experience is a luxury good that, only for the most part, the relatively well-off can afford. And yet it's what most, an awful lot of people aspire to. And, is that necessary? Are there new models? And I think this COVID has maybe helped us look at that, where some schools now do have students in their residence halls taking all their programs online. So maybe you give students a term in a residence hall and you get that sort of fun camp life and, those interactions, but it doesn't necessarily mean that's the only way you can get your intellectual stimulation. And as we've gotten better with online, and as Charlie mentioned, Mercy was online back in 1999, so we were way in the forefront of doing that. You can promote all sorts of clubs, chat rooms, extracurricular activities online that are not costly. And online gives people the ability to have a lot more flexibility in their life, reduces the cost of living because they often can live at home or live with others. So there's a lot of advantages to that from an access point of view. And I don't think we need to look at that as second-class education. It's different. And there maybe you want some in-person and some online, a lot online, hybrid. There's a variety of things. And those schools that are going to come out of COVID in the best way are those who are going to go to new models and who are going to do that. Because the only way we're really going to be able to bring the price of college down is if we bring the cost. And I think that difference is really important. Price, pay to go. Cost is what it costs to run the enterprise. And until we can bring that cost down, we're not going to be able to bring the price down, irrespective of how it's subsidized, how much comes from tuition, philanthropy, and government.
Let me ask you, I'm particularly concerned, Kevin, to get your take on the point that Lucie just raised with regards to digital online type of education. It seems as though to me that if in the final analysis, if you're a low-income minority citizen looking for greater equity in our society, that's going to give you a chance to get a good job, have a sustainable income, be able to raise your family in safe environments and give your kids opportunities that you yourself may not have. The tool for that is a good, high-quality education. And if you can get a good, high-quality education in a quote-unquote non-traditional digital type of a educational environment, does that speak against what it is that we're trying to do as we think about what the college experiences historically look like, what's marketed to low-income and minority kids versus what do they need to actually be successful in our society? And I'm curious, based on your thinking about that, what's your thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first, a couple things. One is thanks for the broader picture, Lucie. I illustrate my own point about having a skewed view of higher ed from the bubble of New England, having been here for 20 years. It definitely influences, I think, how we all look at it, and it's important to look like west of the Mississippi or just all around the country. I think the point about the digital and the access piece, it's interesting because we're I don't know, I don't know how we get to that place where we can look at all the possibilities and alternatives, because alternatives is a very loaded word when you say alternatives to what traditional higher ed is, and even traditional, like the age, like we think of in our bubble, like the 18-year-old graduating from high school and going on to the residential experience, whereas the average age of a college student nationwide is closer to 24, right? So adult learners seems as non-traditional students when they actually might be in the majority. So I look at it in a couple ways. One is, what are the ultimate outcomes, and what's the access and opportunity available to those students, and how is that held in the marketplace? So if a student is attracted to a higher cost option, a more reputable option, because they think it might lead to better opportunities. What is the pushback against that idea? And where are the evidence that we are providing that this is an actual viable path? I think part of the challenge is encouraging people to look at these different pathways, whether it's early college, high school, whether it's 2-year school, transfer to 4-year, because when you look at what the end result is, if they were to say, oh, well, I want to get a job in finance on State Street or on Wall Street, and they see like where those companies are recruiting, and that's where I get back to the companies' role in how they're looking at how they're acquiring their talent and where they're moving. I was doing a couple of conversations with people in HR and how they're moving away from prestige-based hiring and creating algorithms and software so that when they sift through resumes, they can actually exclude ones with like brand name schools and look at and how to diversify their talent pipelines that way. It comes back to that front end of where people are going and how they're getting access. I think another important point to make, though, is for many people, even though we look at residential college as a luxury good, in a pre-COVID environment, a lot of the conversations I had with students and families, particularly those first generation, and under-resourced communities, was that the residential college was an escape from their environment. Right. And, in this new context, if I go to school at Bucknell, and I normally don't say names, but I know that Bucknell is very isolated in the middle of nowhere, Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. And I can be away from this environment that is either toxic or challenging to my learning, then I can then be successful on a whole host of levels, emotionally, academically, socially, and then that would provide me the foundation for that better future, which you mentioned in your comment, in your question. And so I think that's one thing to think about in the COVID era and in online learning. How conducive are those environments are to learning, and how successful are their students going to be, and how might we get to a place where we can make it hybrid, so that in the idea of maybe a co-op. So maybe a student does a 9-week program on campus during the summer, in which they can partner with an employer and have that experience, so that they can be virtually digital for the academic year, but maybe in the off season, they can have that residential experience that's sponsored by a company. And those are the things I think we really need to think about, because it's not an either or proposition. I always emphasize it's and. We're always in the zero-sum game. Well, two ideas can't exist on the same plane. If it's digital, therefore it can't be in person. If it's in person, therefore it can't be this. And so how do we marry these concepts? Because I think we're all working towards the same goal. Even though, I don't disparage higher ed as a business, because it's just a fact, but we're all working towards the same goal, which is helping realize human potential through the power of educational opportunities, right? And if, we can get the access piece there, and we can get them in, and we can help them be successful, we can help them get through. I think the current stat, correct me if I'm wrong, Lucie, but 40% of undergraduates don't complete within 6 years. And that's, there's no way that we should be satisfied with that as a field, as a country, and really work to move the needle on that. But recognize people's motivations, recognize the motivation for the desire to get that residential experience, but maybe provide, through digital, a way to make it both, and to make sure that students can get a valuable experience online, but also that real world experience in at on site, so that they can engage with employers as well, to improve their outcomes in that regard.
Yeah, it's a little higher than 60%, but close. And I agree, that's where it's a real failure there, where higher ed needs to work. And they're doing a lot of work on success. And you mentioned Georgia State before, which has done incredible work on improving student success using artificial intelligence and bots and all sorts of tactics that are allowing them to do it economically, as well as very effectively, because they found that students are more apt to be willing to talk to a bot than a person often. An interesting phenomenon. I don't know if that would be true of our generation, but 18-year-olds perhaps prefer that. So it's very complex. But I just, I heard, Kevin, and so what you're saying, not being as pro-college. And I, when I talk to my friends who are first generation college and all, their hair goes up on the back of their neck trying to say that for low-income students, we should offer them an alternate route that's not the 4-year route ultimately, that will lead to a life of second-class citizenship. And so I think we need to think very seriously. I think as much the upper income as lower income people care about being able to get a satisfying good job when you get out of college. I think that's where college may not be doing the job it should in terms of outcomes, and we're very bad at measuring our outcomes. But I would say, in terms of online, the data shows that the pedagogy and the educational outcomes are as good or better as in person. When there have been lots of studies done measuring that, and that there's some online schools that have extraordinary outcomes in terms of the income that their students are getting. And clearly, when we talk about the benefits of higher ed, it's not just income, but it's the non-pecuniary results that we get. Better citizens, we vote more, we appreciate culture more, all of the things that we've learned in college that give us a more fulfilling life ultimately.
Well, my friends, I think that we've discussed some absolutely wonderful points today, and both of you have been absolutely wonderful in your insights and your knowledge and your experience that you've shared with us. I think I'm particularly happy to end on the topic that we're talking with right now, because we are discussing what a new business model might possibly look like. What are some of the elements that it might contain? And I think the fact that the traditional residential campus certainly has benefits, but there are also liabilities associated. There are certainly benefits associated with the digital online education, but there are limitations to that as well. But I think that if we're talking about equity and opportunity, it seems as though to me that it might ultimately end up a combination that takes and embraces a little bit of both. And I think in our future conversations, as we continue our Inversant Insights, we'll delve into those. I usually say at this time that we call it Inversant Insights because there are no facts associated with what we're doing. It's not a closed-in conversation. We are dealing with some very, very complicated issues in America with regards to how do we educate and upskill our broad population to fully participate in our economy and the quality of life that we want all people to share in this country. So it's going to be a little bit more work for us to do, but both of you today, and so have been tremendously helpful in provoking the conversation and giving us more to think about. So let me say, Lucie, thank you very much for joining us. Kevin, thank you very much for joining us. Are there any last points that you'd like to make before we sign off? Okay.
My last point would be, I just hope we can cut COVID with improved access and improved opportunities for everyone, and that we come up with a model that makes more sense.
I think if we all work on it together and we bring public sector, private sector, businesses and corporation, which is, Kevin, I want to give you a lot of credit for not letting us let businesses and corporation off the hook in this conversation today. There's an important role that they have to play. And to a certain extent, some people have told me they haven't really been at the table enough. So let's hope that we can do more in that space. To all of the folks who are listening, and we've got folks in philanthropy and higher ed, secondary and elementary ed, the private sector as well. Thank you very much for joining us in our conversations today, and we really appreciate your participation. To my good friend and colleague on the Inversant board, Roz Hill, thank you very much, Roz, for your support of this conversation today. And I look forward to seeing folks at our next Inversant Insights, which will be happening soon. Keep your eyes open and be sure to get back with us with any thoughts or concerns or insights that you want to have on the conversation we've had today. With that, I'm going to sign off and say, everyone take care of yourself, be well, wear your mask, and hopefully the next time, the soon we meet, we'll be through this COVID crisis.